Well, he spent his whole life in politics. That was the one thing that really absorbed him outside the profession of law. He was very good at it, though. He enjoyed politics. He enjoyed meeting people, shaking hands, introducing himself. He enjoyed traveling around in Illinois, first of all, getting large groups of people to talk to, and he knew everybody by name. He liked people. He liked to work with people. He liked to help people. And those, I think, are attributes of a good politician. Lincoln loved to tell stories. He would tell stories at the drop of a hat at all occasions. So it was not something that he did just for show, but he just did it naturally. He was a good storyteller, and he enjoyed his own stories, so that when somebody came to see him, he was often reminded of, that reminds me of a little story. And he would start talking, and then as he went along, his face would light up, usually a rather somber face. His face would light up, and he showed that remarkable set of white teeth and a huge smile and tell the story. And when he got to the punchline, he would often slap his thigh like that, and that's the way it ended. Now, he did that constantly. For political reasons, he did for several reasons. He told stories often for political reasons, as in the White House, for instance. He insisted on keeping open doors so anybody who wanted to could come to the White House, and they did. And they came in wanting one thing after another. Frequently, people would come in with some great scheme that they wanted. They wanted to interest him in, get him to do so and so. And Lincoln would say, you know, that reminds me of a story that I have out in Indiana when I was growing up. And he would start telling it, and would go into great detail about who it was telling it, and where it was, and how long it went on, and so on. And at the end of it, his face would break into that marvelous smile, and he'd slap his thigh like that and get up and say, "Oh, Mr. So-and-so, it's so nice of you to come see me," pushing him gradually out the door. And the visitor often had no idea what happened to me. I was making an appeal for something. And I'm shown out of the room in the most genuinely, gentlemanly way that you could think of. It was useful for him. Telling stories also was a useful way of avoiding quick answers, easy answers. And then finally, telling stories on himself was one of his favorite devices to put himself down. This is a good thing for politicians to do, to minimize the ego. For instance, one of his favorite stories, one of my favorite stories too, has to do, he'd tell it, when I was a boy growing up in Indiana, and I was chopping wood out in the woods by myself, and a woman came riding by on a horseback. And she stopped and she looked at me and said, "My land, you are the ugliest creature I have ever seen." And taken aback, like I said, "Well, ma'am, there isn't a lot I can do about it." She said, "Well, you could have stayed at home." And I've always thought that's the wonderful retort for a politician or a public figure. You could have stayed at home. It's hard to explain how any great writer comes to have the gift that he does. And one could no more explain, we'll say, Shakespeare or Racine by saying he did this, that, or the other. So you can't pinpoint Lincoln and say, this was influential. But there were things that were influential. First of all, as an early boy, he had very few books, and they were, it turned out, the great books. He had the Bible, he had Pilgrim's Progress, he may have had Robinson Crusoe, just a few books like that he memorized by heart because he had no others. He loved to read. So that the patterns that he learned growing up were those of simplicity and directness, as well as eloquence. But there were other forces too. When he became a lawyer, his first law partner didn't teach him much, but his second one was Stephen Trigg Logan. Logan, a little wizened, dried-up man who had a hot temper, was nevertheless a master lawyer, and he went over briefs that he and his partners drew up, And he would cross out page after page of nonsense, of legal formalities and so on, to say, this is what we want to say, just these 12 lines, not these 14 pages. And Lincoln watched and he learned. There's a great difference between the briefs Lincoln drew up before he met Logan and the ones after he practiced with Logan. He learned to gain in succinctness, in clarity, in avoidance of technicalities, so that many of his briefs are really literally short essays, works of art. Lincoln carried over the skills that he learned from Stephen Logan into his public life as well. His early speeches were often, like most early 19th century speeches, full of flowery images and big words and long wind-up. He learned from Logan, forget all that. Get directly to the point and people will listen to you. So he did. And he became a master of direct approach to his audience. They felt he's talking to me personally, not some abstract body out there. Now, this carried over particularly as he became a public figure and as he became president. No other president has equaled Lincoln as a master, a craftsman. When you look over his drafts, you realize how carefully he revised, how thoroughly he looked at words, how he decided on this word versus that one as being the appropriate word, not necessarily any old word. So he was a craftsman and worked at it. He knew that his success depended on his skill with language. This is the more important because in those days, of course, there was no radio, there was no television. How do you reach people? You reach people primarily through some public speaking, but mostly through public documents, which are printed in the newspapers. People read a lot of newspapers in those days. In order to read a story in the newspaper, it's got to be short, it's got to have a structure, it's got to have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and it's got to be logical. One thing has to follow after another. He learned this lesson very early. By the time he became president, his presidential messages are models of what a president ought to be saying. Well, Lincoln loved to ride the circuit over many counties all over central Illinois. He turned up at circuit after circuit. Now, this was not altogether enjoyment. This is the way he made his living. And often he was away from his wife and his family for weeks at a time. And poor Mary suffered as a result. But this is the way he made his living. It was very important for him to be able to go into a county that he didn't live in, quickly identify himself, and have young attorneys come up to him and say, I have this kind of case, and I'm not sure about my brief. Would you be co-defendant with me? And he would pick it up, and within a day would have kind of a marvelous way of putting the issues so that the judge would be able to follow. Now, this gave him, first of all, a very wide constituency. In central Illinois, there was hardly a person who did not know Abraham Lincoln, at least by sight. And in turn, Lincoln had a very wide following of people that he knew. And he had a tenacious memory, so that he would encounter somebody in the streets of Springfield and say, oh, I remember we were in Logan County together, weren't we? And the fellow would say, so proud, Mr. Lincoln remembers me. And all of this built up a constituency for him. He understood very well that a public man has to have that kind of following, and he had it as a lawyer, he had it as a state representative, he had it as he ran for the Senate, and especially after he became president. Lincoln was our first Western president. When you look back, you say, well, there was Andrew Jackson. But Jackson had not been born, raised in the West. He went there fairly late. There was William Henry Harrison. But first of all, he lived such a short time. And anyway, he was the son of a great family of Virginia. So Lincoln is the first sort of self-made man who comes from the West. Now, there's a lot of advantage to this. Westerners in those days felt often underrepresented in politics, that all the leaders of the country had hitherto come from the seaboard. Many of them had been interrelated by marriage and so on. Here was a man who was outside, He was not one of those insiders. And this was a great advantage, especially in the West, where people had been feeling deprived. We have nobody representing us in the government. There was a great advantage, too, in that his language from the West was something that was very clearly understood. Everybody could follow him quickly. Whereas if he'd gone to college in the East, if he'd gone to Princeton, shall we say, he would doubtless have studied rhetoric. That's one of the subjects you had to study. And he would understand how you formed an argument and how you use this kind of flower of language and that kind of flower of language. And it would have been incomprehensible to most of his Western listeners, who by and large were self-educated, if educated at all. Now, there were some disadvantages to being a Westerner. One was that when Lincoln became president, he really was not very well acquainted with the nation as a whole. Look at it from this point of view. Lincoln had spent maybe a couple of weeks in a slave state, Kentucky, which was where, if slavery was general anywhere, it was the least harsh of the states where slavery was practiced. So he didn't know anything about Mississippi or Louisiana. Those were not part of his reckoning. He didn't know really much about the East. He had traveled a bit in his later years to New York, to Boston, and he got very good reception. But he didn't know these people and their problems the way he would if they'd been out in Illinois. So there were some disadvantages that show up in Lincoln's behavior. But on the whole, Westernness was, I think, a great advantage. Stanton first met Lincoln, I believe, in a trial case in Cincinnati. Lincoln had been brought in to have a true Western lawyer on the team. He had worked very hard on the case, drew up an elaborate brief, was all ready to make the argument, and when he got to courthouse, he found that Stanton and the people he'd already chosen had made the argument, and he had no role at all. When word came to Stanton that Lincoln expected to speak, Stanton said, "That gorilla from Illinois?" And he just wouldn't let him get on the front of the courtroom. Lincoln was terribly hurt. He not merely wasted a lot of time, but also he was not used to being looked down on. And so for a time there was friction, and one might well have said there would be mortal friction. But when Lincoln became president, and when his first Secretary of War, Simon Cameron, did not work out well, Lincoln knew that it's time to have somebody very able, very skillful, and as blunt as Stanton had been to him in Cincinnati. So he called Stanton in. Stanton was dubious. After all, he didn't know anything much about Lincoln. Lincoln had little experience at that time. Maybe Lincoln would try to dominate him. Lincoln brought him into the family. He listened to him very carefully. He took great interest in the Stanton children. The Stantons often summered out at the Soldiers' Home where Lincoln and Mary Lincoln are summered. He got to know them that way. And gradually, the Lincolns and the Stantons became really quite good friends. And Lincoln trusted him. Stanton, I'm not sure, ever trusted anybody, but as far as Lincoln was concerned, that was nearly as near the person he could really confide in. So by the end of the war, they were thinking about the same things in the same way, and Stanton had become a true ally. A great many people started out with a negative view of Lincoln. First of all, in looks, he was ungainly. In those days, a man 6 foot high was something very unusual. 6'4", he stood out in any crowd, and especially since he insisted on wearing that top hat, which would put him even higher. He looked odd, though he tried, and Mary tried even harder, to keep him pressed and neat. He just could not be neat. His clothes always looked wrinkled, and this is partly because he traveled so much. He had stuff in the suitcase, and he'd take it out and put it on. His accent was Western with a twang. He would tend to say, somebody to him, "Well, why don't you sit in that chair rather than chair?" That sort of thing. And people thought, this is an uncouth kind of person. How could this man be president? And then you got to working with him, get to know him, And I would offer as a kind of general law, there was nobody associated with Abraham Lincoln closely who did not come to admire and love him. He had almost nothing in the way of personal enemies from anything that he said or did. He was a very attractive, interesting, engaged man who would listen to you and actually hear what you're saying. And that's a remarkable thing. So that by the time you got to see Lincoln 3 or 4 times, you realize this is an intelligent man who likes me and I like him. And with the feeling being mutual, they became often very close. Lincoln, before his assassination, was certainly strongly criticized. He was Abraham Africanus, the friend of the blacks, but not a proper citizen. He was uncouth. He all the matters that one could think of there. And when it came to voting, over and over again, Northerners tended to vote for more polished and better educated Democrats. This was just the way it was. And when Lincoln announced the Emancipation Proclamation in 1862, it created such a hostile reaction that the Republicans lost most of those congressional races. So that there was great hostility. There was also hostility among fellow Republicans, most of whom were better educated. They thought they were smarter than Lincoln. They certainly had more experience than Lincoln. And they thought, this is a kind of a rough fellow who's come out of the West who doesn't really know what he's talking about. It took quite a while for a man like Charles Sumner, who, polished as he was, Harvard-educated, friend of Joseph Story in the Supreme Court, widely traveled in Europe with always a pocket full of letters from the Duke of Carlisle and so on, to think anything good could come of Abraham Lincoln. But Lincoln managed him. Lincoln flattered him. Mrs. Lincoln also flattered Charles Sumner, who was easy to flatter, and he was indeed a tall, handsome, gallant, well-trained young man. And he became increasingly a part of the Lincoln entourage. When the Lincolns went out for a carriage ride, they would often take Sumner along with them. So that by the end, as Mary Lincoln wrote, he and Sumner and Lincoln were on the best of terms, and Mary said they played together like 2 young boys, which is unlikely, one thinks, for Lincoln, even more unlikely for sedate Charles Sumner. But he relaxed with Lincoln. Now, this kind of transformation occurred with a great many people. So I think it's a mistake to think of Lincoln in his pre-assassination period as being disliked. He was suspected. He had many critics. But on the other hand, he also had many friends. Then comes assassination. This is the first great American assassination. There had been an attempt on Andrew Jackson, but not successful. There had been a couple of presidents who had died in office, but that's very different. The tragedy of it all, a man struck down in his prime, struck down of all things on Good Friday, brought to Americans a sense of total loss, especially since nobody knew where do we go from here. Nobody knew much about Andrew Johnson, except that he had a bad temper. There was no other alternative, and they thought, we're lost now with Lincoln. We have to follow in his steps and try to find out what they are. So increasingly, people wrote eulogistic biographies of Lincoln, nearly always finding him one of the great men, sometimes calling him a saint, which he wasn't, but they loved him. And that, I think, is the change that came about in Lincoln before and after his death. Lincoln had, I think, as little experience as anybody who's occupied the White House. I'll think back on it. He had served 1 term in Congress without distinction. He had never been mayor of his town, never been governor of his state. He had never been a member of a Supreme Court. He was very little known, and there was a feeling that he has never actually done anything much. He was recognized as a good lawyer, but he was the head of a 2-man law firm only, not one of the big Chicago firms. They did try to enlist him, by the way, to come up to Chicago and live, and he said no. He was used to a really small firm in Springfield. So how did a man like that learn experience? How did he learn to cope with people, how to lead? Well, first of all, he had an innate tact. Second, he started off with some bad blunders. It took time for him to get on his feet, so to speak. It had almost any new president, as a matter of fact. It took time to learn the ropes in Washington. He worked at it very closely and very hard, and by the middle of his first term, he was already a master politician, well endowed with the knowledge it takes to rule in Congress, to make suggestions, and to get your way. But it was not something that came easily for him. He had to work at it. Lincoln himself thought of himself as a moderate, as somebody who did not go to extremes. There were within his own party radicals, like Charles Sumner, who wanted to act decisively against the South, whether they had the power to do so or not. They wanted to declare all slaves freed. They wanted to divide up Southern plantations, and so on. Lincoln was not interested in that kind of dramatic, drastic action. He knew that to get any measure through Congress, he had to have a certain amount of Democratic support. This Democratic support could come from the group called War Democrats, those who went along with Lincoln as fighting a war for the Union. But once he announced, I'm going to abolish slavery, I'm going to remake Southern society, they would drop off, and he knew it. He had a Republican base. He reached out to the Republican radicals, but even more, he reached toward moderate Democrats. By the end of his term, he was a centrist, so much so that it was not possible to nominate anybody who would outflank him either to the right or the left. The Democrats felt this, and the Republicans even more so. There was a kind of a rump Republican movement to replace Lincoln in 1864, and they thought of people like Salmon P. Chase, the Secretary of the Treasury, who was indeed a strong abolitionist and a very careful figure in promoting himself. People realized that it wouldn't work, that he had almost no following, and when he tried to set up a party of his own, Lincoln let him go his own way. He didn't dismiss him from the cabinet for ages, and when Chase was ready to form his own party, there he was marching with his banner, and nobody was behind. It was a wonderful feat of allowing people to have their own way, not cutting them off, but gradually working them into your following, and very successfully so. Lincoln, to be sure, put up with more from George McLellan than most of us would for any other person. He repeatedly urged him to take action, and McLellan couldn't. The army wasn't ready. My horses' mouths are sore. And Lincoln wrote, what on earth have your horses been doing that makes their mouths sore? He couldn't get supplies in time. He was not ready to attack. There would be all of these things. Now, why didn't Lincoln fire him? One big answer, and a good answer, is that there was nobody to take his place. Ultimately, Lincoln did dismiss McLellan, and look what happened. In his place, there was Burnside, bumbling Burnside, who led to catastrophe. Oh, good gracious. There was Joe Hooker, who boasted, he was going out and kill all the Yankees, all the Southerners. And he again had disaster. They could not lead. There was nobody in the offing that Lincoln could say, aha, if I pick this man, he would do better than McLellan. Now, over 2 years in the West, he watched very closely as generals developed, away from Washington, away from his overseeing eye, away from politics, and several of them were becoming major figures, notably Grant and Sherman. Watching them closely, Lincoln thought, aha, this is the team that I really ought to have. So when the final blow came, it became necessary to dismiss McLellan. Lincoln turned at once to Grant. He went out to the West. He did not know Grant. Maybe they had met once, but I think probably not. Grant did not know him, but Grant was a very loyal soldier, in contrast to McClellan, who played his own hand. Grant would do whatever the president wanted and do it extremely well, as he'd already done in the West. He brought him to Washington. He made much of him, and Grant was indeed totally loyal to Lincoln. So this is the evolution. Would McClellan ever have fought a battle if he'd been in power, a major battle? Would he ever have won a victory? I think nearly everybody agrees not. He might have had an engagement and then pulled back before it got underway. He probably would have retreated and tried a new plan of maneuver. But McClellan was not an aggressive soldier. His forte was arming, getting equipment, getting the horses ready, all the entourage, but not for fighting. Grant, on the other hand, cared little about this. He appeared in his old work uniform, no epaulets and medals and so on, all ready to go. He settled down at once to work, not for show, and he got the results. Abraham Lincoln, as a young man, knew almost nothing about slavery. He was born in Kentucky, but he was too young to have any memories there. In Indiana, of course, there were no slaves. In Illinois, he saw very few blacks, and they were not enslaved. He did take a visit to Louisville and its environs, and was well treated there and by a great plantation, which did have slaves, but he didn't really know much about slavery. So what his concern was in those early days was not particularly slavery, though I'm sure he thought of it as a bad institution. What he was thinking about was how it impinged on the white settlers, or how it would make areas like Kansas, for instance, a slave state. Or rather than letting it be free, Kansas would become a new, shall we say, South Carolina rather than a new Pennsylvania. This worried him a great deal. So his early stand about slavery had to do very simply with its expansion. He did not want it to go further than it was. Now, at the time, a great many people agreed with him that slavery was a dying institution, that if you could constrain it, if you put these limits around the southern slave states, they would ultimately have to get rid of the institution themselves. It would die of its own accord, that it had to expand in order to live. Now, that was the mindset of the pre-Civil War Lincoln. He was, of course, opposed to slavery, and when he appeared in the Lincoln-Douglas debates, he said flatly, if slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. And he said that I would not be a slave, I would not be a master. But he didn't plan to do anything particularly about it. He was constrained by the Constitution, which said this is a domestic institution that individual states rule on and decide about. And if they could just keep it that way, he thought it might be all right. And then the southern slave states became expansionist. First, the move into Texas, that vast area that potentially had the makings of being 4 more states, all slave states, and then further into the West. And presently in 1854, Stephen A. Douglas opened up the rest of the national territories to choosing whether they wanted to be free or slave. And from Lincoln's point of view, this showed slavery on the warpath, that we are going to be hurt here because slavery is going to encircle us rather than we containing slavery. So his views became stronger, but even so, he did not propose any practical measures to do away with it. Then comes the secession of the southern states. He becomes president of the United States. What should he do? In his first inaugural, he assured the Southerners that your peculiar institutions are safe in my hands. And that sounded all right, except the Southerners didn't believe him, and they started withdrawing from the Union. And as they did, he increasingly came to see that they were withdrawing because of slavery. Slavery is the central institution there in the Confederacy. Furthermore, living in Washington as President of the United States, he saw a great many slaves, also a great many freedmen, and for the first time had some acquaintance with blacks as individual people, notably Frederick Douglass. But before that time, Lincoln had thought of blacks as maybe somebody who cuts your hair every now and then, or, takes care of milking your cow. Now, Frederick Douglass appears. This is a powerful man, well-educated, an immense orator with a huge following, who comes and gives specific plans to Lincoln of what ought to be done. And Lincoln is taken by him. This is a man of intellect. Clearly, some blacks, at any rate, are as smart as some whites. And his view toward slavery gradually becomes very different from what it had been. Presently, he came also to see that the Confederacy would not exist, could not survive, if slaves were emancipated, because their economy depended on slavery. And if they didn't have those slaves working in the field, the whites in the army would have to go back and support their families. So something had to be done here. Finally, as the Union armies advanced, more and more blacks flocked around them, hundreds, thousands of them, a kind of a black trail, so to speak, following the Union armies. And many of these were able, they helped the Union fight, and presently he enlisted them in the Union armies. So that by the end of his first term, Lincoln had come to have a very different view about blacks and about slavery. And when that occurred, he was now ready to move to the next step. He knew he could not unilaterally free all the slaves successfully. His constitutional powers did not allow it. He could free them under military order, but that might not be constitutional and might not last. The time had come for an amendment to the Constitution. And Lincoln, the shrewd, practical politician, worked carefully with the Congress to get exactly the number of votes that were needed to pass that 13th Amendment. And, of course, ultimately it was ratified to his great joy that it was voted by Congress. He also came slowly and sometimes reluctantly to see that blacks were people of real achievement, that they served nobly in the Army and did very well at places like Port Hudson, where they led in the attack, that they were to be depended on. And ultimately, at the end, when it came to the question of reorganizing the southern states once they were conquered, he began to see that we're going to have to take blacks into account. We're going to have to see that they're freed. And the best way to do this is see that at least some of them, at least the educated ones, ought to have the vote. And this was rank heresy, something that Lincoln in 1846 would never have said. Lincoln in 1856 probably would never have said. But comes 1865, he realizes we've got to these people, they are our allies, we've got to do something for them as they have done for us. Well, historians like to play if games and what if, and what would happen if Lincoln had not been assassinated, or what if he lived after an assassination attack? And of course the answer is we don't know, and nobody does know. We make some guesses. Probably the readmission of the southern states, or some of the southern states, would have been easier. There would have been less draconian Reconstruction measures, and probably there would have been some guarantee of the rights of freedmen. The black codes enacted in Reconstruction would not have been tolerated. Whether this would ever have led to real equality for blacks, I think is uncertain. And indeed, I'm not sure blacks still have complete equality. Things would have been different also on a political level. Lincoln had just been reelected by an overwhelming majority. He had now the mandate that he never had in 1860. He was able now to go to Congress and say, I want this done, and the people are behind me. And he could move in that fashion, which he could not do earlier, so that measures for Reconstruction could have been enacted by Lincoln that would be more moderate, more careful, slower probably, and on the whole, probably it would work out better. But who knows? Some years ago, when I didn't have anything much else to do, I went through a series of newspapers looking at a presidential race to see how often people invoked Abraham Lincoln. The answer was everybody invoked Abraham Lincoln. If you were a racist, you said Lincoln hated the blacks. If you were an equal rights person, Lincoln loved our blacks and tried to give them freedom. If you were a Republican, Lincoln loved the Grand Old Party. If you were a Democrat, Lincoln was at heart really a Democrat. He just ran on a Republican ticket. Everybody loved Abraham Lincoln. Now, that's some legacy to give. It is a legacy of understanding this, first of all, was a very great leader, and we've had so few in our history. Second, that this was a man of absolute integrity that you could trust whatever he said, and we've had so few people like that in our history. But also, this was a man of peace who wanted to adjust, who did not want to dominate, who did not want to rule like a czar, who did not want to be an emperor of the South. He had modest goals, he kept to them, and I think that's one of the legacies that our presidents ought to keep from Abraham Lincoln, namely that there are realistic limits on the powers of a president that Abraham Lincoln knew and that we ought to know too. I have great sympathy for Mary Lincoln. Mary Lincoln was left an orphan at a fairly early age. Her stepmother did not like her and pushed her out of the nest as soon as she could. She went to live with her sisters, including the one in Springfield, when she was an adolescent. So she had a hard bringing up. She had a father who loved her, that's true, but her stepmother really did not like her, and they didn't get along at all. So Mary had no experience in close, relaxed friendship with other women. And this made it hard for her when she moved to Springfield. Her sister put up with her, but they were not really close friends. She had very few close friends. And it was easy to take a dislike to Mary because, first of all, she was pretty, she was lively, she was vivacious, and she caused envy among the other young women in Springfield. And that's easy to see why she might well be disliked. All the young men were courting her, and that again is a reason why if you were a young woman in Springfield, you might think that Mary Todd is a dangerous character. Well, of course, she married Abe, and their marriage was in many ways a very rocky one because he was not used to dealing with women at all. He didn't know anything about women. His mother had died. His stepmother was an uneducated dear old lady, but he didn't learn anything from her. He had little association with women of education and competence, and so he had to adjust his sights too. It was a rocky first start for them, and they had some serious quarrels, including a break-off of the engagement before they really got married. But they did get married, and they decided to make do of it. It was a hard life for her because he was away so much of the time on the circuit. She was a good mother. They had how many children? They had Robert, they had Eddie, they had Willie, and they had the youngest called Tad Thomas. Now, Robert grew up not really knowing his father at all, raised by his mother, and he was not a lovable person. On the other hand, Eddie was always sickly, and we have no personality for him. Willie was apparently the delight of the family. He was smart, he was clever, he was witty. He wrote poems at age 8 that were published in the newspapers. He had a wicked sense of humor in the White House, this little boy. As his father was out in front on the stand making a speech about how we must support our troops and we support the Union, and the people in front started laughing because they had behind him Willie and Tad, the littlest boy, had got a big flag of the Confederacy and stretched out behind him. There was no malice, they were just being funny. When Mary Lincoln was having a big reception, all the ladies in their crinolines, their big skirts that were all around, and they were in the East Room sipping whatever he gave them in those days. The doors would burst open, and here would be Willie and Tad pulled by a nanny goat on a chair. They went rushing through the flock of ladies who gather up their skirts as best they could because they were riding sled. It was a chair from the White House. They had very little discipline, but Lincoln did not believe in discipline for children. He said, oh, well, let them grow up as they like. They'll be constrained much in the future. Let them try. Mary was perhaps a little more strict, but she could not bear to punish her children, and she loved them. She doted on them. She was an excellent mother. We know this in an odd sort of way from the digging in the septic tank behind the Lincoln house. There was no garbage collection in those days, so you threw all your waste in a pit behind your house. And some people, I don't envy them the task, excavated this to find what did the Lincolns eat? How did they live? And rumor had it for years and years that Mary Lincoln was so stingy she barely fed her family. Well, you dig out the septic tank, and here are bones from the best cuts of beef and the best cuts of lamb. Clearly, Mary kept a good table. She was a good cook, and she fed her family and cared for them very well. She loved them. Now, when she gets to Washington, things are different. First of all, she has an old entourage of servants, most of whom had been there from the previous administration, most of whom she did not trust. Second, she had a budget that she was to remodel the White House. And Mary had no experience with money. She knew the White House was, as Lincoln himself said, this damned old barn, and it needed something done for it. And so she went out on a shopping spree to get things for the White House. She went to Philadelphia in the big department stores and looked at what they had in the way of drapes and of furniture and of silver. She went on to New York and did the same kind of thing. And she ordered, like mad, one might say, because $20,000, which she had at her disposal, was a vast amount of money for Mary Lincoln, who had never seen more than, I guess, $100 at a time. And so she ordered all these things for the White House, and they came in. She furnished the White House in what was, for those days, good taste. We would think it is ornate, overstuffed, very Victorian. But people commented on it that it was indeed very nice. And then the bills began coming in. And Mary had no money to pay for them. She committed much, much more than the Congress had allowed. And the manager went to Lincoln and said, what are we going to do about it? And Lincoln, for once, lost his temper. He said, I'm not going to pay for these things, these trinkets that she's buying, all these frou-frous. Why, this house was better when we moved into it than any house we ever lived out in Springfield. I won't pay it. Then he said, I'll pay it out of my own pocket, which, of course, he couldn't afford to do. Well, ultimately, they sneaked it into the budget under a different item, and they did pay for it. But Mary Lincoln's extravagance became well known, and it persisted after that when she bought jewels, when she bought necklaces, when she bought bracelets. She had an irresistible time of buying. Now, this is the more understandable, I think, when one realizes that before she became Mrs. President, she had lost her first son, Edwin, whom she loved. Well, children did die early in those days. She comes to the White House with 3 boys. Robert's off at Exeter and Harvard studying, but the other little boys were there. And she wanted them to be well-dressed. She wanted them to be well-mannered. She wanted things to be exactly right for them. And this is one reason why she bought so much. She spent so much. She cared so much. And she wanted to impress the public. And the public, of course, was not impressed. They would come in the house and they would say all this money she has spent. And this went on for a while, though she gave a couple of major parties that people seemed to enjoy a lot. But at that point, poor Willie fell ill, probably typhoid fever. The water in Washington was all polluted. They drank right out of the Potomac. And Willie, to a less degree, fell ill. During one of their big parties, Mary Lincoln and Abraham Lincoln stole off and went upstairs from time to time to nurse this very ill child and try to bring him through it. And he got through for a few days. But then one morning, the secretaries in the office saw Lincoln come in, breaking into tears, and he said, boys, my Willie is gone. He's dead. The poor little boy, the brightest of the Lincoln family, had died. This was a blow to Lincoln, and more to Mary Lincoln. She had her whole heart fixed on those children whom she adored. and she simply could not get over the loss of Willie. The funeral was very sad. She was much too ill to go to it. And Lincoln buried the little boy in a mausoleum there in Washington, but went back with Stanton, by the way, to have it opened once or twice. He just could not believe the boy was gone. Mary Lincoln never recovered from all this. She grieved so that for the rest of her administration, she was cloaked in veils of black garments. You could hardly see her through that. She was so moved and so distressed that at one point Lincoln had to take her to the window and point down the Potomac where there was an insane asylum. And he said to her, "Mother," he called her mother, "Mother, you had better get control of yourself or you're going to have to be sent down there one of these days." And she tried. She really did try, but she had had such losses. Coming on top of that, the assassination of her dearly loved husband, and she adored her husband, was just more than anybody could bear. She collapsed. Presently, her mind was not safe, and she lived a tragically unhappy life for the rest of her years. As a little boy, I didn't have access to a lot of books, but my mother had bought a series called The Real America in Romance. I don't think anybody had heard of it since that time. It's about 12 volumes, and it was a kind of a beautifully illustrated narrative history of America from the discovery down to whatever the present date was, maybe the 1920s. Looking back on it, it was sappy, it was sweet, it was altogether a story of triumph, but it was fun to read. And I learned a lot about the Aztecs and the Mayas and all things like that, as well as about American history. And I think that got me interested in American history, sort of trapped by American history, so to speak. And I've been with it since. No, I didn't. I was pretty sure until I graduated from college that I wanted to be a band director. I played the clarinet rather well, I may say, and my expectation was to get a job as a band director in some high school in Mississippi, where I grew up, and that would be my life. Maybe I'd teach social studies on the side. Well, I have a little story about that. Like Lincoln, I have a little story. It was summer. I was my senior year. I heard of a job over at Indianola, Mississippi, which is in that flat delta area. It goes on and on and on, no hills, no anything. Hot as Hades. I heard there was a job there. I went over to see it. I had no money, so I hitchhiked over there. I came rather dusty, I'm afraid, by the time I came to the principal's office, but he seemed pleased to meet me. And we talked about the job and what I would be doing. You'd be teaching this, that, and the other. And there were a couple of things that bothered me about it. One was, as we went around, he said, "Now, you'll be leading the band, and the band is financed by this Coca-Cola machine." And I said, I don't think that's very sound financing. "Oh," he said, "you don't know Mississippi and Indianola in the summertime where it's 100 degrees. That Coke machine is a steadier source of income than state taxes ever would be. You'll be fortunate to be dedicated to you." Well, that sort of took care of that. We went back to his office. He said, "Now, if you come, you'll want to find a place to stay. There's a boarding house right on the street here. I'll introduce you if you like." I said, "That's fine." So he got up and collected his papers and such, and I got whatever little thing I had and followed him. He turned and said, "Where's your hat?" I said, "I don't wear a hat." He looked at me and said, "You teach in my school, you'll wear a hat." And I decided I don't want to be a high school teacher. So at that, I went off to graduate school. Well, when I graduated from college, I had no idea what to do, and I certainly had no skills that were marketable. And I heard about graduate school. I didn't know anything about graduate school at all, what you did, except that it would be a substitute for a job. So I applied at, I believe, 12 different places. A little story about that. I went to Millsaps College, which is an excellent small college in Jackson, Mississippi, but it's small. And I had a professor that I leaned on a lot and loved, Vernon Wharton, an American historian. And so I told him I'm applying to these 12 places. He said, David, I'm glad to write for you, but I don't have a secretary and I don't have a time. I cannot sit down and write 12 letters for you. I said, but I'm applying at 12 places. Well, he said, this is what I'll do. You write the letters and I'll sign them, whatever you say about yourself. So I went back to my typewriter and I wrote 12 letters recommending me, most notably. I'm kind of amused to say that 10 of them got me fellowships. Well, sometime, a long time after that, one was at the University of Illinois, which I attended. A long time after that, Illinois asked me back to give a lecture or some such thing, and we visited and so on. And because it was a long time ago and I hadn't remembered everything, I had asked, could a graduate student look over my graduate record just to remind me what I had been doing when I was there? And he came up, something interesting. In my file there, there was a letter of application signed by Vernon Wharton and written by me, of course. And on the margin was the note of the dean. Admit this man, he said, he has excellent letters of recommendation. So I've always felt rather fraudulent, but I certainly enjoyed my years at Illinois. Well, I don't think I was treated as a gifted child. I was certainly a spoiled child in a large family of children. I don't think they had any idea about a professional career as a historian or so on. It would be conceivable to think of a career as a lawyer. It would be conceivable to be a doctor, though that required more money than my father had to put into for one child. And so the idea was simply that the children got a good college education and they were on their own. And they did, all of us did different things. My sister became a bacteriologist. My brother became an agronomist and things like that. I didn't really have any skills in doing anything, except I'm a good typist. And so the idea was maybe you should keep on going to school until you learn something. And that, yeah. There were several books that inspired me, well, one of which I don't think I would recommend particularly these days, but H.G. Wells' Outline of History. It's a wonderful book that tells all about history from, the Nebuchadnezzar down to the present. And it, for the first time, gave me some sense of perspective of where we stand in a very long history of the world and a very small segment. That kind of book did fascinate me a great deal. And perhaps it got me steered in the direction of history. But when I started graduate school, I had no idea that I would wind up studying Abraham Lincoln and the Civil War and such things. You don't hear a lot about Abraham Lincoln or the Civil War in central Mississippi, I just was going to school, as I said, to have something to do. I got to the University of Illinois, where, fortunately for me, the great professor on the American history side was James G. Randall. Professor Randall and his lovely wife, Ruth Randall, took a liking to me, partly, I think, because she was very Southern, and I was very Southern too at that time, I guess. And they, in effect, virtually adopted me. I was at their house time after time for dinner, for supper. They took me to plays, they took me to movies. They treated me like an adopted child. And so when the chance came to be his assistant, a graduate assistant, I leaped at it. And even so, I had no idea what I was going to do. I just got it as a job. He was working on his big biography of Abraham Lincoln, Lincoln the President. And he needed somebody to check references and look up books and so on. And so I was doing that. After a year or so of that, Professor Randall came. I can remember clearly. He's stumping, a short man of fact, stumping over to my apartment saying, the time's come for you if you've got a thesis subject. And I said, I don't think that's right, but I don't have anything. Well, he said, you've been working on Abraham Lincoln now for about a year for me, and you've accumulated a lot of information. It'd be a pity for it to go to waste. So I suggest that you might want to write a biography of William H. Herndon. Herndon was Lincoln's law partner and biographer. His papers had just become available in the Library of Congress. We had them on microfilm. And he said, with what you already have, you could work on these papers and write a life of Herndon. It would also be about Lincoln. And I thought, that's an interesting idea to sort of capitalize on what I did know. I worked on it. That was my doctoral dissertation. I was fortunate enough to have it accepted by Alfred Knopf, first round, and they published it in 1948. And that sort of, can you say, trapped me in the Lincoln Civil War field. Professor Randall was a great advisor and a great mentor. He taught me, I think, in the best possible way. He was not a brilliant lecturer. His courses were fairly pedestrian. I didn't think his seminars were particularly interesting, but working with him on a one-to-one basis as his assistant, I think that's the way one has to learn to be a historian. That is, he was writing, and if he needed some particular reference, I had to go find it and get it. If he was writing, he wanted everything checked meticulously over and over again. So I had to take the manuscript over to the library and check it all out. So that by working closely with him, I got to see, first of all, a lot of the library and its extensive holdings. But I got, even more important, to understand what a scholar is about. It's about care, it's about painstaking, it's about judgment, as well as about very skillful writing. He was an excellent writer as well. So in that sense, Professor Randall and Mrs. Randall shaped my future career. There really was no connection between my growing up and my academic interests. I didn't know what I was going to do when I went to graduate school, but I had a vague feeling that maybe I should write a history of Mississippi, my home state. And that would give me something to connect with my roots, so to speak. And I thought about it for quite a while. And then I realized, I don't know much about Mississippi. And my own training experience was very meager in that I lived in a town of 680 people, half white, half black, that my knowledge of the broader aspects of Southern history was very skimpy. So that I decided that's not for me. I'd better skip to something where Professor Randall knows a lot and can help me find something that I can learn a lot about. So, does it matter that I was a Southerner? Yes, I think it does. In certain senses, I think the fact that I grew up in the South, the deep South, has contributed to the fact that I am, as you can judge, a nonstop talker and storyteller. And Southerners tend to be. This, I believe, was a help in my early books because, where most people are writing a dissertation like an abstract of a recipe, I sort of spread myself and I told stories and people found it interesting. One of the people, a great professor on my doctoral oral exams, read the dissertation. He said, Mr. Donald, I see that you're trying in some places to write very well and to reach a large audience. I said, well, yes, I would like to do that. Well, he said, I don't think that's to be encouraged. I have a rule. He says, when I have written anything that I think is clever or witty or striking, I always go through and rub it out. You should do that. And I said, well, maybe that's what I should do. And then he said, but after all that, I really enjoyed reading your thesis, and I usually don't. So I thought, well, okay, maybe I'm hitting on something here. So I think Southernness in that sense had something to do with it. Also the fact that I grew up in a half-white, half-black environment. I've always found African-American people perfectly happy to be associated with me and vice versa. I don't have any race prejudices whatsoever. And this has made it a lot easier for me to talk about the South, to talk about race relations, to talk about civil rights, than perhaps some other people who have fixed ideas on these matters. American history is exciting. First of all, we're really the only modern nation whose entire career, entire history is available to us. That is, we go from the very first papers about the settlement at Jamestown all the way down to the present, and the documents are there. There are no mysteries about it. If you were writing about the history of England or Sweden and so on, you'd have to go back to the depth of time and still wouldn't know how did things begin. So in America, you have a kind of case study of the development of a nation and how it grew and why it grew this particular way. And this has always had a special fascination for me. With the Civil War, there is in particular the fascination of two roads. One might have led to an independent confederacy, two nations on this continent. What would have happened since that time? And it sort of encouraged you to imagine things were different. And the other was the road that was taken. So one puzzles over these aspects and tries to figure out, what can I do with this? What could I make out of it? Well, my ambitions as a graduate student were quite modest. I hoped that someday I'd get a Ph.D., that with a dissertation that was acceptable, I might get a job teaching at Illinois College in Jacksonville, Illinois. It's a lovely little college, right near Springfield, but not too close, 40, 50 miles. It has good high standards. It's a wonderful place for undergraduate education in the Middle West. It's sort of the Middle West equivalent of, say, Amherst or maybe Williams. And that was my aspiration. It never occurred to me that I would go on to a university, and that I would go on to write books that people would read and so on. I was just looking for something quite local. I had as a postscript here that a couple of years ago, I had the great fortune to be given an honorary degree from Illinois College. I went out there and loved it and reminded them that this is the career that I almost had. But I did not start out like Abraham Lincoln with a little engine that had no rest as my ambition. I started out thinking, well, maybe I can make a reasonable living teaching in Illinois College. Well, sort of one thing led to another, and I got a traveling fellowship from the Social Science Research Council. It was to allow me to investigate sources in many parts of the country, and I traveled a lot, mostly by bus from Boston to Los Angeles, and did visit all the major libraries and learned a lot from them, and wrote up a good long report of what I had found. Somehow or another, this report went to the Social Science Research Council, and one of their members picked it up and said, you know, this is an interesting young man who's been doing all of these things. Why don't, he taught at Columbia, why don't you bring him to Columbia? He'd be kind of fun to have around. And so I got a letter in the mail asking if I'd like to teach at Columbia. And I said, oh, sure I would. And so off I sped to become an instructor at Columbia University. Such a thing would have been absolutely unimaginable to me when I entered graduate school. But I think it was a fortunate break. My first Pulitzer Prize was for my first volume of Charles Sumner, the Massachusetts abolitionist. And by that time, I'd been working for some time on it. I was very much surprised. The book was supposed to be one large book, but I'd been given an appointment in England to teach for a year. I talked to my publisher about it, and he said, look, if you stop for a year, you're going to find it very hard to come back to the subject and finish it. Why don't we publish what you have finished? And then you come back and you start the second volume. The first, what I'd finished, ended with the outbreak of the Civil War, and therefore formed a kind of unit. And so I said, great, let's do that. And they published that book, Charles Sumner and the Coming of the Civil War. It never occurred to me, honestly, that it would win a Pulitzer Prize because no one single volume in a series had ever done that before. Nobody had ever taken volume one of, a multi-volume series. And I was just astonished, pleased, and delighted, of course. And I did get back to Sumner, and I did go back and write a second one, a rather long one after that. But on the whole, I think historians don't, by and large, work with a view of prizes and rewards. If they do, they're nearly always going to be disappointed. My great editor, Simon Schuster, once told me, these prizes are so political that nobody can count on them going one way or another. So nobody should set his heart on them. And I never really have, to tell the truth. Somehow or another, I always thought of myself as rather special. Who doesn't? But it never occurred to me that one day I would be an ancient historian being interviewed for television. I was just going to be, I hoped, a good college history teacher. And then things sort of broke for me. I started teaching at Columbia in the influx of GIs from World War II. And they needed extra people, so they had hired me. And I liked it there, and it turned out that they liked me, and students liked me. So again, I thought of this as a very temporary kind of thing. I have kept, or rather Mrs. Randall kept, the letters I wrote during those years. And one of them says, I'm enjoying New York a lot, and I like living here, but I can't imagine living here for any length of time. I assumed that once my 2-year contract was over, that I'd go back maybe to Jacksonville, Illinois. But they needed people, and apparently I filled the bill. I still was so uncertain about the future, though, that when Smith College was looking for a professor, and they wrote down to Columbia and asked if I'd be interested, I said yes. And so I resigned at Columbia and went off to Smith. The people at Columbia were baffled by this. They said, why would you leave Columbia to go to Smith? I said, well, I don't belong at Columbia, you know that. I'm very different from the rest of you. I'm going to Smith. And they were angry that I had spurned them, so to speak. I went to Smith, and while I liked the students individually, it clearly was not for me. And in the second year there, I was fortunate enough to be asked, would I go to Princeton, would I go to Yale, or would I come back to Columbia? And since I didn't know Princeton or Yale, I thought I'll go back to Columbia where at least they know who I am. And so I went back to Columbia. And at that point decided, okay, I guess I'm going to make a career as a historian, and tried to do so. I don't know how anybody judges the contribution he's made to a field. I can tell you that my largest contribution, I'm sure, the most lasting one, is my graduate students. I began having graduate students at a very early age and continued until our retirement. And ultimately, I had between 70 and 100 graduate doctoral students, of whom 50 at least have published major books. Many of these were dissertations, which they did under my direction and then published. And these students are now major professors at major institutions all over the country. And I can think of myself as a kind of a Johnny Appleseed, spreading the word, so to speak, at a lot of different places. They are, I believe I'm right in saying, they are all fond of me. I'm in touch with them all. I write to them. I think of them frequently. I think of their children as being my intellectual grandchildren. And in a few cases, I've actually taught the grandchildren, which is nice too. Now, was there any particular moment that I would say this is the peak of my career? In a sense, it was. By that point, this is 1960, teaching at Princeton. Christmas vacation was just over. We came back, and I was beginning my class all over again. It was a sizable class, 200 students, something like that. And as you see, I enjoy lecturing, I enjoy talking. So I like these students, I like talking to them and so on. And we were going along one day after another. And one morning as I came in, every student rose and started clapping. They had just heard that I'd won a Pulitzer Prize. And I hadn't heard it myself. I was just overwhelmed. And I think that may have been the high point of my career. I have generally had few setbacks and few obstacles. I've been very fortunate in that things have been handed to me rather than my going out after them. There are a few roads that I didn't take that I maybe could have. When I was a graduate student, maybe a second-year graduate student, I worked frequently at the Illinois State Library in Springfield. And one day the director of that library called me into his office and said, I have some news to tell you that's still very hush-hush, but I'm resigning from this job. I'm going to the Chicago Historical Society, and I'm going to recommend that you be appointed in my place. And I was stunned. A second-year graduate student. I hadn't published a thing. Suddenly to have this dropped in my lap. And I thought about it. I thought, this is a real opportunity, but I don't think it's for me. I'm not the administrative type. I don't like to run things. I don't like to boss other people. I just like to be my own. So I said, I think I better pass on this, so I'm deeply grateful for it. So that was one path that wasn't taken. A little later, I was teaching at Columbia and got a phone call from the Abraham Lincoln Association in Washington, D.C. There was the Lincoln Bicentennial Commission. And the spokesman was Daniel Boston, who was working in that commission at that time. David, he said, there's being a change in the Bicentennial Commission here. We need a new director. Would you like to do it? And I thought to myself, God, I don't want to do this sort of thing. This is a public relations kind of job. It's in Washington. You deal with all these senators and congressmen, try to get appropriations. And I said, this isn't for me at all, man. I just really don't want it. And so they went to somebody else. So there have been careers that I didn't take really quite deliberately. I stuck to a fairly narrow career, and I've enjoyed it. In my early years, I got almost no criticism. This was in part due to the fact that I was young, and people tend to be kind to young people. But it also had some other factors as well. I was writing my book on Herndon, which was my first published book, and Professor Randall had sponsored that as a dissertation and read the manuscript for me. That summer, I encountered Carl Sandburg at the Library of Congress, and he read the manuscript and liked it and volunteered to write a foreword for it. And so when the book came out, Orville Prescott, who was in the review of the New York Times, said, I don't know how to review this book, he said. It's endorsed by the two greatest Lincoln people in the country. J.G. Randall is the noted scholar, Carl Sandburg is the noted poet, and they both say that it is good. So I have to like it. And he went on to say, I really did like it anyway. But I generally had a very easy life. Now, this doesn't mean that I've always been easy in my own criticism. I used to write enormous numbers of book reviews, many of them sharp. Perhaps I was trying to bring people up to my standards. Perhaps I was just a young and acerbic. Anyway, over the years, I came to think that's not the best way of encouraging people or even discouraging people. So I tend either not to review books that I don't like, I already know I'm not going to like them, or to review more generally, putting them in some kind of broader context. And that has been my tone for the last 25 years. As far as criticism that I've had in these recent years, there's been some of it, and some of it's kind of interesting. One argument is that I'm an apologist for the slave society of the South, because after all, I am a Southerner. Things like that. I haven't let them bother me, and I really don't. Every now and then, somebody comes up with something that sort of tweaks the record a bit, saying that this is a man who wrote a 2-volume life trying to demolish Charles Sumner and show he was mad. And this is the one time I wrote to the Times saying, why did you publish that? I have never written anything like that about Charles Sumner. And I give a quotation. He's one of the great men of the time. I don't know why you did this. And they agreed. We don't know why we did it either. It was a mistake. But mostly criticism doesn't affect me much. American history has already changed so very much. I look back on my own career, and believe it or not, when I was teaching at Columbia, I used to give 2-hour lectures on the nullification controversy in South Carolina. And believe it or not, I knew everything about it at that time. Don't ask me now, I don't know anything about it. That kind of close political history has almost disappeared. And instead now, we have a psychological history, much of which is very good. We have women's history, and we have minority history, especially Black American history. So the subject of history and subject of historians has already changed a great deal. And you differ as you write about these very different subjects. I never dared to write about women or women's history because I'm not sure a man is able to write about women's history. And I've never written anything significant about Black history because I suspect that only Blacks are capable of writing and understanding Black history. But these are frontiers that the next generation is going to have to deal with, and I hope we'll get some masterworks out of them. My biography of Woolf was something of a surprise to everybody, perhaps including myself. I had finished several Lincoln books about aspects of Lincoln in the Civil War, and I thought to myself, I don't think I want to do that again right now anyway. But what would I do? About that time, we decided we'd go on vacation in North Carolina. There's wonderful areas out there in the Western Mountains, and we enjoyed it immensely. And driving back from the mountains, we went through Asheville. And I thought, we ought to stop there and see Thomas Wolfe's house, which I had seen once before, but my wife never had. And so we did. We went through that house. It was a very impressive old house. And it was huge. It was indeed, as Wolfe's father said, a damned old barn. It was practically empty. All these little cubicles with a light hanging down by a cord in the middle of it, a narrow, flat bed, maybe one bureau and a chair. That's all they were furnished with. People came to rent rooms there because of the mountain air, and Julia Wolfe made a living for the family by renting. And I thought to myself, isn't it odd that Thomas Wolfe, who writes the most luxuriant prose of any American, is so full of description, who's so full of wonderful language, should emerge from this absolutely barren background? And I told my wife, somebody ought to do something about Thomas Wolfe. And she said, oh, yes, I ought to. And we drove home. It sort of buzzed in the back of my mind. I came back to Harvard, where I was teaching at that point, wondering what I was going to do. And then I thought, I wonder where Wolfe's papers are. And I began looking at it. And they're all in Houghton Library, the rare book library at Harvard. And I thought, well, this is quite unusual. Suppose I go over and take a look at them. And I went and asked the curator of manuscripts, would he show them to me? He took me into that wonderful building, and you go down 2 floors deep into the subterranean vault, all air-conditioned and all that sort of thing. And there are rows on rows of black boxes of papers and so on. He took me to a wall that stretched probably, we'll say really the length of this house that we're in now, as far as you could see. Those, he says, are Thomas Wolfe's papers. And I said, you got to be kidding. Yes, he said, they kept everything. He never threw away anything. And that is true. He said, I heard him to say that there were between 3 and 6 million pages. He later said, I didn't really say all that, did I? But a lot of paper there. And I thought, okay, this is something I can do while living in Lincoln, Massachusetts. This is a subject that I've been interested in. It's a change from Abraham Lincoln. Why don't I do it? And so I set to work doing Thomas Wolfe. And it was quite a change. I had to teach myself something about, literary criticism, about deconstructionism, about a number of matters that I had not previously dealt with. So it was an educational process for me, and I loved it. And I liked the people who worked on Thomas Wolfe. They were all very genial and companionable, helpful. And so Thomas Wolfe emerged from that. When you talk about achievement, when I talk about achievement, I tend to use flat, much too frequently used phrases, namely that you have to work hard. And I think most people don't realize that writing is very hard work. It doesn't come easily to anybody, and then you have to revise and work over and over and over again. Second, it requires a lot of time in research of what's behind all of this before you start writing. And third, it requires what I think many biographers do not give, is a lot of thinking of what does this all add up to? Why am I writing about this person? Why is he worth my time? And that's hard to answer sometimes. You could pick a minor subject and maybe make a major book out of it. But unless you're sure in advance that it is a major subject for you, it's probably not worth all the close attention and the hard work it's going to take. The American dream is one of those loose phrases that we use in too many contexts, I think. But by and large, Americans have had similar aspirations. Aspirations to be free, aspirations not to be meddled with, not to be told what to do, aspirations that mean the whole future is ahead of you. You can do all sorts of different things, and you don't necessarily have to do what you were slated to be when you were in the 9th grade or the 12th grade or first year college. The world is really open to you, and there's so many choices that you can make. And in many cases, you would do as well in one choice as another. You're not sort of fixed from the beginning. I'm going to be a scientist. I'm going to be a historian. I'm going to be a farmer. You probably could be good in all three of those roles, but you have to choose between them. I wish I could predict what the greatest achievement of the next quarter century is going to be. I can predict what I hope it will be, a new source of energy. If we do not find for this world, this globe, a new source of energy, we're going to be running out very shortly. We're already seeing shortages in many different areas. We need sources of energy to take care of our water supply. There's Atlanta, Georgia, it's really perishing for lack of water. We need sources of energy for our cars, or else we're going back to traveling on foot or bicycle. We need sources of energy for faster communication, and these have to be devised. There's not something immediately in sight that we can say, oh, well, that's going to come in 10 years. We've got to spend a good deal of thought and care in producing that. It's going to be a revolution as great as the Industrial Revolution was in its time.